AP 120, Lab 14, Topics Urinary System. All right, so the urinary system looks deceptively simple. Out of the organs, we have the right and left kidneys attached via a ureter to the urinary bladder. So a ureter comes off of each kidney and goes to the urinary bladder, and then the urinary bladder connects to the urethra to get rid of the urine. Note it's urinary bladder, 2 words. Here is our model, right and left kidneys, ureter, urinary bladder. Open it up, we can see the urethra here. Also note that there are little ridges on the inside of the urinary bladder. Those are called the rugae, and it helps allow the urinary bladder to stretch. And then there is this smooth area that's shaped kind of like a triangle, and it is called the trigone. So the smooth area is the trigone leading to the urethra. All right, here is a lovely cartoon of a kidney. The outer layer of the kidney is called the renal capsule. It has this area or space called the renal hilum. The renal hilum is where structures enter and exit the kidney, including blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, nerves, and the ureter. The outermost layer of tissue that is deep to the renal capsule, this lighter colored tissue, is called the renal cortex. And the renal cortex includes small pieces called the renal columns. So the renal columns are where the renal cortex goes deeper into the kidney. Here's the ureter. Then we have this darker tissue. One single subunit of this darker tissue is called a renal pyramid. So this here is one renal pyramid. Here's another renal pyramid, another renal pyramid. If you add all the renal pyramids together, that is collectively known as the renal medulla. So all of the renal pyramids equal the renal medulla. When you get to the point or apex of the renal pyramids, you end with a structure called the renal papilla, which is fitting into this whitish structure. So renal papilla, renal papilla, renal papilla. Then, of course, blood flow is very important for the functions of the kidney, since the kidney is removing wastes from the bloodstream as well as maintaining the proper composition of blood. So the way it goes is blood arrives via the renal artery. Renal artery then splits into the segmental arteries. Segmental arteries split into the interlobar arteries. Interlobar arteries then go over the top of the pyramid, where they're called arcuate arteries. And then the arcuate arteries branch up into the cortex, where they're called cortical radiate arteries. So again, renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, and cortical radiate arteries. Blood, of course, then has to leave the kidneys through veins, and basically the veins have a similar name. So cortical radiate vein, arcuate vein, interlobar veins, and renal vein. Again, here's just another view of the blood flowing around a structure known as the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney. So again, here is the cortical radiate artery, and branching off of it is a small microscopic vessel called the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole arrives in a capillary bed within the nephron called the glomerulus, and then blood exits via the efferent arteriole, goes into a second capillary bed called the peritubular capillaries, and then from there it will return the blood to the cortical radiate vein, and so on. So once the blood arrives in the cortical radiate artery, it branches into smaller structures that are associated with the nephron, and then eventually leaves the nephron and exits out the cortical radiate vein. Here is just again the list of vessels that will be utilized by blood flowing through the kidney. Renal artery to segmental arteries to interlobar arteries to arcuate arteries to cortical radiate arteries to afferent arterioles to the glomerulus. to the efferent arterioles, to the peritubular capillaries, and then cortical radiate veins, to arcuate veins, to interlobar veins, to renal veins. All right, there are two main regions to the nephron, that microscopic functional unit of the kidney. The spheroid portion is called the glomerular capsule, and within the glomerular capsule is where we find the glomerulus, that important capillary bed. Then the tube coming out of the glomerular capsule, that full length of that tube is referred to as the renal tubule. Here's a close-up of the glomerular capsule. So we have the parietal layer of the glomerular capsule on the outside, the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule lying on top of the glomerulus. So here's the glomerulus by itself. Here's the glomerulus with the visceral layer of the glomerular capsule on top of it. So again, blood has to arrive in the glomerulus, so it arrives via the afferent arteriole. Blood carries the blood into the glomerulus, and then eventually the blood will leave via the efferent arteriole. And then coming out the back of the glomerular capsule is the proximal convoluted tubule. All right, then we have the renal tubule. So coming out of the glomerular capsule is the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it comes after the glomerular capsule. Convoluted because it's all twisted up, and tubule because it is tube-like. Then the filtrate flowing through it will travel through the nephron loop, dipping down into the renal pyramid. So here's the nephron loop. Here's the descending limb of the nephron loop, carrying the filtrate down. Here is the ascending limb of the nephron loop, carrying the filtrate back up and to the distal convoluted tubule, which then will deliver the urine into the collecting duct. So, again, blood arrives via the glomerulus, and filtrate will leave the bloodstream and enter the glomerular capsule. That filtrate will then travel into the proximal convoluted tubule. It will travel down the descending limb of the nephron loop and up the ascending limb of the nephron loop and lead to the distal convoluted tubule, and from there into the collecting duct, which then leads to the renal papilla. The collecting duct is not part of the nephron. So only from the glomerulus down to distal convoluted tubule do we have nephron. All right, here is our close-up model of the nephrons. So this is, of course, these spheres are the glomerular capsules. If you cut the sphere open, you can see the glomerulus itself. This is the proximal convoluted tubule, the descending limb of the nephron loop, the ascending limb of the nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule, which then empties into the collecting duct heading to the renal papilla. So either nephron on either side has the same structures: glomerulus in the glomerular capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, descending limb, ascending limb of the nephron loops, and the distal convoluted tubule leading to the collecting duct. And blood vessels found in this part of the model, we have the interlobal artery and veins. We have the arcuate artery and veins arcing over the pyramid. We have the cortical radiate arteries. There's a cortical radiate vein here. And cortical radiate arteries and veins are connected via the peritubular capillaries. So this area here is the peritubular capillaries. All right, the nephron is both in the renal cortex and in the renal medulla. So it is both in the cortex and the medulla of the kidney. And there are millions of nephrons per kidney. All right, so the flow of urine. So once the filtrate leaves the nephron and enters the collecting duct, it is now officially urine. Urine travels through the collecting duct down to the renal papilla, where it will pass into the minor calyx. So the beginning of these whitish tubules are the minor calyxes. The minor calyx then leads to the major calyx, And then the major calyxes lead to the renal pelvis, still within the kidney. And then when the structure forming the renal pelvis passes through the renal hilum, it is officially now the ureter. And then the ureter travels to urinary bladder, which then gets rid of urine via the urethra. And that is it for this part.